Thanks very much. I feel like I'm a bit of an imposter here because I don't do technology really very well. I'm most of anything that's vaguely technical I don't know anything about, so you may wonder why I'm here. But I'm going to talk to you about talking statues, which I hope you've seen. This statue on your way into the British Library. The project itself, Talking Statues, was developed by Sing London, who some of you may be familiar with. They've animated lots of spaces, with things like pianos and ping pong tables and all sorts of exciting ideas. They developed this idea of talking statues, where they wanted to animate statues by commissioning writers to write a short piece and to use high-quality actors as well. An absolutely essential part of the project was testing technology, and they wanted to test near-field communication, NFC, the technology that's used in Oyster cards. There was a real eclectic mix of statues, as you can see from here. They varied from Peter Pan through to Hodge the Cat, Lowry in the pub in Manchester, the goat in Spitalfields, so a real mixture, and a mixture of locations as well. They produced a map, and I've left some of these at the entrance, so you're very welcome to take copies of these, but you can find them from the website as well. There were a real diverse range of statues in London and Manchester, and the reality was that Sing London had to be quite pragmatic about what statues they could use, because they had to get permission from each of the planning authorities, each of the local councils, to agree to their statues being used, and that was problematic. So you'll see in the middle of this map here, a sort of absence in the centre here, and that's because Westminster didn't want to play game. So there weren't too many there. Sing London also had a huge number of problems with statues being removed, roadworks happening around them, you name it, it happened. So it's a huge selection of different statues. These varied, as I say, a huge range of them. So things like Queen Victoria on Blackfriars Bridge, where the writer Elizabeth Day and the actor Prunella Scales were involved. The people like Nicholas Parsons talking as Hodge the Cat, and then Anthony Horowitz doing a piece for Sherlock Holmes in Baker Street. There were a smaller number of statues in Manchester, and the scheme is now developing also in Chicago as well, so it's being extended elsewhere. So the idea was to get the statues to talk, and this is what you'll see. And as you come into the British Library, you'll see outside the statue there, you'll see this plaque. It mimics the idea of blue plaques, and so all it says is talking statues here, Sherlock Holmes here, and you tap, type or scan, and then be amazed. So that's the information you got, minimal information about how to use this and what to do. And the idea was to use your mobile phone to access the website, and you'd get a call from the statue. I tried to put this in, and I'm not sure if it's going to work.
Hello, and meow. Good of you to call by. I don't mind if you stare at me. Take a good look at me. Examine my expression. I am justifiably proud. I preside in Gough Square in all my glory. Let me tell you about myself. I'll try and do that without hesitation, repetition, or deviation, if you have just a minute to spare. I am Hodge, perhaps the most famous cat that ever lived. Not only is there a statue in my honor, I'm also the subject of poems and plays and epitaphs. I'm quite the feline celebrity.
Okay, that's just a short clip from it, and each of the statues had a phone call like that, and a different person, and also the length of these vary considerably. That one is quite short, it's actually not 1 minute but 2 minutes, but some of the others were much longer, and that was one of the challenges I think that Sing London had in terms of writers getting a little, wanting to do things for a little longer than they perhaps intended. So the idea was, and just mapping here what the experience was, so the user would use the URL, QR code or NFC, and then they accept the code, they accept the call, listen to it, and then the idea was it would take them to web content, so the map of talking statues, or they could share the information with a friend. And here you can see the website, so you get some of the information about it. The partners in the project, the creative partners were Sing London, and the technology design partners were Antennae International. We were the research partner, the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries at Leicester University. And this was funded through Leicester, through its digital R&D fund for the arts. So it was that combination of 3 different elements that they were interested in, of the creative aspects of it, the technological aspects, but also a research element as well. And that's where my expertise in another area comes in, which is based around the idea that the research that I'm involved with is very much around the way in which people receive and the way people are impacted by cultural experiences, particularly within museums. So the research centre is located in the School of Museum Studies, and we undertake research which is very much focused around looking at informing and enriching creative museum thinking, policy and practice. And we want to support museums to become much more dynamic, inclusive and socially purposeful institutions. So we're interested in the visitor experience, the user experience. So how is it that people, how did they receive talking statues? What was the experience they got? So the research question we were asking, how do people engage with and experience talking statues? To what extent does talking statues and its use of NFC enhance cultural experiences? And there were lots of ambitions in terms of the application that was made to Leicester for this funding to reach people who perhaps have limited experiences of cultural experiences, to get people to move from pathways almost, from one experience like a talking statue to use other cultural venues and things as well. For it to reach disabled people on a large scale. Lots of ambitions with the project. The research element of it, I have to say, was quite limited. It's quite a small project. And there were some challenges as well. And this was mainly to do with the challenges that Sing London had in setting the project up. Because of the planning problems that they had getting consent to use statues, there was a delay in the start of the project, but there wasn't a delay in the end when the research report had to be completed. So it was very condensed. It sounds a familiar story, I'm sure other researchers will have experienced that as well. Okay, so what did we do in terms of the research design? Well, we looked at some of the literature around this, so we were looking at other examples of similar projects. We did data analytics, we looked at web analytics, we did some short questionnaires, some short interviews, we did interviews with technology designers, we did some observations, so we did quite a lot of just looking at how people were using things. We also tested the emerging findings. This took place, the launch of it took place, of Talking Statues took place in August 2014, and the deadline for the report was October, so you can see why it was a challenge. So, what did we do? What kind of data did we get? Well, we managed to collect data from a range of people over a 7-week period. We had data analytics. The area that we weren't able to get was the web analytics, which it had been hoped this would be available. But we were able to do short surveys. We used quick tap surveys with users, and we got 190 questionnaires from users and 290 from non-users. And then we did some follow-up interviews as well. As I say, also the observation, which was fascinating, really fascinating to just see what people were doing and their patterns and things. So how did the public respond? Well, I think the first thing to say is that they were very excited by the concept of this. It was an immensely enthusiastic response. The users were captivated by the novelty of engaging with talking to a statue. They loved the idea of the statue phoning them up. And some of them were trying to have a conversation with the statue, which was quite intriguing. And they were a bit frustrated when the statue just kept on talking. So there were challenges of that. There were practical challenges, which I'll talk about a bit later. But they loved the idea of giving a voice to a statue across Manchester and London. They loved the animation of it, giving them new life. It raised the profile of the statues in public spaces. It enabled people who perhaps wouldn't connect with them to be connected. It gave them a sense of being able to understand things in a different way. So they really liked the novelty of it. As I say, they loved the phone calls. So it was a very, very positive experience. But it wasn't without some of its challenges as well. So we asked participants, people who use this, which of the following describes your experiences of talking statues? And the highest percentage, over 50%, said it told them something new, it made them laugh, it animated the statue, and very few negative responses, only 2% saying it bored them or distracted them or it annoyed them, only 1.5%. So very, very positive responses to this. Amanda, who is English, in her age group between 36 and 45, hadn't known about the statue of Isaac Newton. She didn't know he represented a famous scientist. And she said, aesthetically, I dislike it, but I feel interested in it now. I thought it was quite an interesting point to make. Maria, an Italian, said she'd learnt about the details of the statue of Hodge the cat, things which had puzzled her. I've seen the statue lots of times when I visited Dr. Johnson's house, she said, and I've always wondered about the shellfish, and now I've discovered. So people were finding out things that they hadn't expected. We also asked people how did they find out about talking statues, and what we found quite intriguing about this was the aim was that talking statues would encourage spontaneous cultural encounters with statues and the public. Just over a third of the users, 36%, their encounters with talking statues were spontaneous. They were just passing by, and it was a chance encounter. But talking statues received a huge amount of local, national and international media coverage. And a large proportion of the users, 41%, had their curiosity stimulated by media coverage. This was a really important element of it. They'd seen it on television, they'd heard about it on the radio, they'd seen about it in newspapers, and that was their motivation for trying it out. And they'd have people, this is an example, Carol, a British woman, said she was inspired to come to London today to explore talking statues. She loved the idea, she'd seen it on TV and wanted to try it out. So she'd made a special visit, but she actually didn't have a smartphone, so she'd had to bring her friends with her so she could use their phones. So there were some challenges as well. So, why did you want to visit the statue? And we've got this thing that there were people that were passing by, lots of people were specifically interested in the theme of it. They were interested in the concept of talking statues. But what was interesting, with less than 1%, people didn't seem to be motivated by the writer. So less than 1% were interested by that, and just over 1% were interested in the actor who was doing it, although there were very high-profile people involved in this. There were lots of other factors that challenged people as well. So places like the British Library, Isaac Newton was well used, and one of the reasons for that is that it's a pedestrian walkway, there's seating in the area. Places like the Peter Pan statue is in Kensington Gardens, again a relatively quiet space. But things like Rowland Hill, who's in King Edward Street, is on incredibly busy road, lots of traffic, and facing the road as well. So practical elements like that become incredibly important. Lots of people were very keen to listen to Sherlock Holmes, but you come out of the tube station on Baker Street and there's traffic thundering past, the pavement's congested, and there's an exchange thing just behind you, so it's often a challenge to do it. There were other environments like, say, Paddington Station, the Unknown Soldier, which are very busy. And lots of people were clearly en route for, they were going to get trains or just getting off trains, and were much more engaged in their day-to-day activities. So the context of where the statues were located, I think, was hugely important. So how do people use the statues? Well, what's interesting from a lot of the data that came in is that there is obvious spikes at the weekend. So fictional characters like Peter Pan, which got the most number of responses, and Sherlock Holmes were very, very popular. But you can see that there are clear ways in which these were being used, particularly at weekend high points. 91% of the users thought the content of talking statues was interesting. Julie praised the content of Isaac Newton. She said that it was a brilliant idea. It told her about Newton in a nutshell. She thought it was good for all ages. It explains concisely what he did, and so she found it very accessible. Rob said he enjoyed learning facts about Newton and about gravity. And so people felt that it was enhancing their knowledge. Not everybody liked things, and there were some challenges about particular statues. So there was a diversity, and actually Peter Pan, which was very popular in terms of people were interested in it, it was actually the least popular in terms of the content. People hated the voice of the actor. So James thought the voice of the actor was unsuitable for the character. He was unsure who the recording was aimed at. In his opinion, the language was too complex for children who would love to have called Peter Pan, and it wasn't right for adults either. Veronica criticised the script and the voice of the actor, who she considered at odds with the statue. It damaged her engagement with the statue, and she wanted something of the magical Peter Pan that she had in her imagination. So, there were challenges like that as well. Carol talked about Isaac Newton as being a very meaningful encounter with the statue. She explained, I was intrigued to hear new things about Newton, from Newton. I liked it being him as a person. Talking statues brings a statue to life. It's not just a block of carved stone. So the way in which it was delivered was enormously important for her. What were the characteristics of the users? Well, what was intriguing was that the users were existing cultural consumers. They weren't new people. They weren't people that don't already use things. The majority were confident cultural consumers who are used to visiting cultural organisations such as museums, galleries, archives and so on. 85% said that they visited 3 or 4 times a year, 16% once a week, and 33% at least once a month. So there were people that were used to using these kind of environments. Encouragingly, talking statues attracted users from a wide range of ages that were interested and confident at using technology, mobile technology. The only age group that wasn't represented in the user groups were over 75s. It's interesting that 25% of the users were between 26 and 35, but 20% were between 55 and 65. So that idea that older people aren't interested in technology, I think, is challenged. Over 75s weren't, but the younger, older people were. Increasingly, the project didn't attract, interestingly, the project didn't attract large numbers of younger people, than was expected. That was expected to be an outcome from this, but it was not the case. Around 20% of those were between 16 and 25, so it's about the same proportion as the 56 to 65s. Most of the users, 62%, were female. Most were employed, 64%, and 16% were retired, and 14% were in full-time education. So we're talking about a particular group of society. Only 2% were disabled, and I think that's, given that the population, they're up to 20% of the population are disabled, I think there are big issues really. Non-users to talking statues tended to be between 16 and 35, male, British, white backgrounds and so on. So lots of them said they were too busy to take part in it and so on. Participants talked about how talking statues gave them a better understanding of place and location of where the statue stood. It helped them to understand the context. This was particularly the case for the goat in Spitalfields Market, providing an overview of how the space had been used in the past and explaining the symbolism of the goat. So the audio content was very important. There's one guy who's an Indian living in London who talked about understanding why it was a goat. It gave it context, otherwise I had no idea. For Carol, engaging with the statue of Isaac Newton gave her a new appreciation of the surroundings. It was a new view of the area, the fantastic skyline of St Pancras. It made me look at the environment for longer, dwelling in the area, slowing down and looking carefully. So to what extent does talking statues and NFC enhance cultural encounters? Well, this study took place in 2014, so NFC then was still very new and its use was very limited, and in fact only 5% of the users used it. So we had many more people using QR codes and the URL as well. This was partly to do that 45% of the users were using iPhones, which didn't have NFC, and 34% using Android phones. So lots of people didn't understand the instructions. Some of the plaques, the blue plaques, were on the ground for planning reasons. And when it said tap, people were trying to tap with their fingers or their feet. So people's understanding of how to use it and understanding of the technology was often a challenge. And as researchers, it put us in a situation where we had to help facilitate that often. So despite the proliferation of mobile phones in society, using them outdoors can be frustrating. Phone batteries have a finite length of time. It's difficult to recharge them. Access to the internet fluctuates and depends on the user's access to free Wi-Fi. And lots of people were nervous about the tariffs of phones. That was something that was brought up as well. So there were lots and lots of different factors which people were anxious about, how much it was going to cost. There were lots of international users and they were anxious about roaming charges, so they wouldn't engage with it at all. So there are lots of factors which I think need to be thought about in terms of making it as available as possible. Users also had to be persistent with the technology because it often didn't work immediately. So one person was saying, Newton didn't speak for some time, so I wasn't sure if I got a connection. So people had to be patient, and often people would give up if it didn't work immediately. Despite the challenges experienced by users getting the technology to work, 65% said the technology was easy to use. And it was funny this, they put that even when you'd spent 10 minutes with them getting it to work. So, but you know, once they got going, they were absolutely hooked on it and thought it was brilliant. So I think there were some challenges in that way, and people were much more confident once they'd done it and knew what to do. So the reasons why the technology wasn't easy to use was that one person said NFC wasn't working, the URL took ages to connect, some users needed to have the technology explained to them. You know, there were lots of factors. One of the other things that also seemed to be significant was that length does matter. The length of the recording of some of them just seemed to be too long. Observation showed a gradual disengagement with some of the audio recordings where people became visibly uncomfortable and started to lose concentration near the end of the phone call. So although they were very enthusiastic about it, I think looking at how people operated, they were perhaps less keen. To what extent were we creating enthusiasm to further and extend those cultural encounters? Well, 62% of the users were interested to find out more about the statues and its subject matter, so they wanted to do more things and it was motivating them to do something. As a new technology, there were challenges with NFC, but people were very optimistic about what the future would hold, so there was a real positivity towards this. It wasn't seen as being negative in any way. And people were very keen that they would have as much access as possible. So the users described their experiences of talking statues as meaningful, amusing, informative and intimate. Their enthusiasm generated by the project was real. People loved their involvement. It captures people's imagination and attracted interest in diverse age ranges. People were impressed by the technology. Some people were marvelled at the technology because they thought it was absolutely brilliant that they would get a phone call from a statue. They're excited by the concept. They found the novelty amazing and compelling, and having a phone call from a character was fun, intriguing, entertaining, and could at times be a moving experience. So the concept at the heart of talking statues, to animate an otherwise silent object, opens up huge possibilities for thinking about all sorts of contexts: rural landscapes, outdoor historic sites, architecture, sculpture parks, war memorials, community spaces. And I think there's something that's been raised, particularly by Andy today, which I felt particularly concerned about with this project. And I think what this did was to perpetuate the kind of cultural consumers consuming more culture in a self-perpetuating process where the new technology is just as exclusive, and so it's not extending necessarily to a diverse use of a group of users. So I think if you're really serious about how this kind of technology can be used, then I think you need to think very carefully about how you include everybody, because there are those people who don't have phones, who can't afford it, who are very concerned by how much their mobile bill will be, and don't have the confidence and the experience to know or understand how to do this. So choosing where those statues might be seems to me as much a social justice issue as places like the British Museum representing, Britain or the world. So I'll end it there. Thank you.